You guys ever thought that the Adidas Yeezy 700v3 was a really awesome looking shoe, but just didn't really get the comfort that it deserved? Like, I don't know, maybe it needed a boost or something? Well, I thought so too. And we're gonna go ahead and give it that little boost that it needs in today's episode of Sailboat's Customizations with another sole swap hybrid. Ever since I originally saw the Yeezy 700v3, I thought it was an incredible looking model of sneaker. It has a very kind of futuristic look with a really awesome glow-in-the-dark cage, and I thought that the overall silhouette was actually pretty impressive. When I found out that it was going to be the first Yeezy 700 model to not feature a boost midsole, I was actually really disappointed, and that was one of the big turn-offs from this shoe. Over time though, I started to think about it, and I thought that there's got to be some way that I can make these sneakers have boost without utilizing like a boost style insole like Hefe Luxe. And then I started to look at a pair of Yeezy 380s that I had in my collection, and I noticed that they had a very similar kind of midsole and outsole pattern. So I decided, why not try to give these bad boys a sole swap? I had to purchase myself a pair of Yeezy 380 Calcite Glows. You guys may recognize Kyalcite Glows from one of my previous customizations when I actually dyed the uppers, so I had a completely unique one-of-one colorway. Today, I'm going to be taking the sole off of a fresh pair of Calcite Glows, and I'm going to replace the sole of my Yeezy 700v3 Kyanites. So these guys will finally have a boost sole like they deserve. Overall, in a side-by-side comparison, there's definitely a lot of striking similarities between the outsole and the midsole of these shoes. They line up almost one of one, with the exception of the rubber pieces coming up for the toe cap in the front of the shoe. You can tell that on the 380s, the toe cap is just a bit narrower. The other striking difference is actually with the tread of the outsoles. Both of these shoes have completely unique tread designs. Along the medial aspect of the shoe, curves are a little bit more defined on the 700v3. I'm really excited to get started with this project. It's one that I've had on my mind for quite a while, and I've just been waiting to finish up with clients' projects before I started to get going with a personal of my own. I'm really pumped to add a glowing midsole and outsole to the 700v3 Kyanites. I'm also thinking about potentially getting some glow-in-the-dark laces to make this thing just a lot more vibrant. Let's get down to the first part of the process, which is going to be detaching the midsoles from the uppers on both pairs of shoes. The sole removal process actually turned out to be a lot more challenging than I had originally anticipated. Based on my previous experience with sole removals with both 4D sneakers as well as with the Yeezy 350s, I had a feeling that this was going to be really easy, but it actually wasn't. The way that the midsole actually rode up onto the upper of both the 700v3 and the 380 kind of caused it to be really challenging to get leverage and therefore really hard to pull the uppers from the actual soles. It took a lot of brute force, a ton of acetone, a ton of time, and a lot of burns on my hands, even with the heat resistant glove because of the heat coming from the steam gun. At the end of the day, the removal went pretty well. It was just a lot more labor intensive than I had ever expected, and it really took a lot of significant finessing in order to pull everything off correctly without damaging any of the components. At this point in time, I have successfully desoled my Yeezy 700s as well as my Yeezy 380s. I'm not gonna lie, this was actually a little bit of a more challenging process than I had anticipated going into it, but they both turned out pretty damn good if I say so myself. And taking a look, the outsole and midsole of the 380 is going to match up absolutely perfectly with the 700. I'm really excited to get deeper into this project, but the next thing that we gotta do is prep work. Unfortunately, prep work is one of those necessary evils that has to be done. It takes a lot of time, it's super redundant, it's boring, but the better the prep work is, the better the outcome of the project. Let's take a closer look at the separated pairs here so you guys have a little bit of a better understanding of exactly what they look like with the soles detached. And then after that, we will dive into the actual prep work process. First up, we'll take a closer look at the 700s here. One of the most challenging aspects of separating the 700v3 upper was this plastic glow-in-the-dark cage that goes around most of the upper. The thing that was so challenging between separating these two surfaces is the fact that they stuck together so well that you had to make sure that you were getting between them. Otherwise, you could literally rip off pieces of this glow-in-the-dark cage like you see right through here, as well as a little bit closer to the back. You can see it kind of flapping up. It was really difficult to actually get those surfaces separated, and the surface that I thought was going to be the most challenging was this mesh portion. That actually turned out to be the easiest part of the process. It's definitely not coated with any other sort of chemical or any sort of substance to help to kind of keep the stitching in place. So you also have to be a little bit more delicate when you are trying to remove the uppers as to not tear the stitching. You can see the Ortholite midsole here, and just pushing into it, you can see that it just does not have nearly as much give as Boost. These outsole and midsole portions that wrap up are a lot stiffer too in comparison to the 380 midsole and outsole, and that actually makes the shoe a little bit less comfortable on foot in my personal opinion. Both shoes came out pretty evenly. A small little tear in the mesh over on the medial side of the right shoe, but the plastic glow-in-the-dark cage actually came out a little bit better, minus this little part on the heel here. However, the rest of the shoe looks really good. The toe box on the right shoe came out a little bit better than the toe box on the left shoe. It was a little bit of an easier process, so that's something I'll definitely have to trim off some of that excessive glue and material from the midsole there. Quick look at the 380s here. A little bit more plain because it's just this Boost kind of midsole that's inserted into this encasement here, which keeps everything a little bit more taut than on like an NMD or an Ultra Boost. The back portion, the heel cup here, was incredibly difficult to detach due to the fact that it was really hard to get any sort of leverage. But once you get to the actual Boost portion, it was really easy to remove the uppers from the midsole. One little mistake I did make was I pulled a little too hard. I got a bit of a tear, but once everything is glued down, it's going to be barely noticeable. Everything else came apart really nicely. Unfortunately, like I mentioned, I did kind of tear up at the stitching for the uppers of the 380s there, but the rest of it all looks pretty good, and that will be utilized for another project down the line. Same issue with the uppers on the right side here, a little bit of a tear. There's no sort of substance or chemical that kind of keeps the stitching protected there, so you have to be really careful. Now that you guys have had the opportunity to see what these kicks look like when they're all detached, it's time to get into the prep work. Let it begin. Any of you guys that have paid attention to any of my restoration or customization videos knows the actual prep work process is easily the longest, the most challenging, and the most tedious of any part of the process with any sort of restoration or customization. With the sole that I was trying to clean up, I actually had a hell of a time, and the glue did not want to come off even with acetone and the heat gun, so I ended up resorting to using my rotary tool to help to remove all the excessive glue. The sole that Lola was working on was a little bit easier to clean up. The uppers, I ended up using a combination of both cotton balls with acetone as well as my rotary tool. And the prep work is now done, and it took a serious amount of time to clean off all of that excess glue. I found out that some of the materials on the uppers from the 700v3s are pretty sensitive to acetone, and that was what I was primarily using for my glue removal. I had to be very careful with the amount of acetone that I was using and the amount of pressure that I was applying, because it actually ended up damaging the uppers of the shoes in a couple of spots. Also, the sole that I was prepping turned out to be incredibly difficult to remove all of the glue, so I ended up resorting to using my Dremel tool, which kind of shaved down the midsole a little bit, but actually cleared off all the glue a lot more easily and a lot more quickly than just doing it with acetone and heat alone. The sole that Lola was working on went really quickly, and that glue was actually a lot easier to remove. We're finally at the point where we can start to re-glue. It's about that time that I apply some of the glue and get these things ready for the final process. The actual glue application process was the easiest part about the entire thing. I just had to make sure that I didn't get any excessive glue on the uppers of the shoes. In order to do this, I utilized a pencil to draw lines that I would not apply glue beyond. Alright guys, we are on the final step of this re-glue. I ended up doing 3 coats of glue on there just because it was kind of hard to tell where I was getting my clear layers, but after I put on a few layers, I could tell that everything was well coated and definitely ready to be clamped. Because I put on 3 layers of glue, I actually let the glue set for about almost 3.5 hours. That way when I'm actually placing everything, it comes out exactly the way that I want it. This is the biggest part of the entire puzzle here. It's the most important. It's also the most stress inducing because if I fuck this part up, then I gotta go through and redo everything all again, which is a pain in the ass. So without further ado, here we go. The reheating and clamping process is definitely the most nerve-wracking part of the entire process, because if you mess this up, then you have to pull everything apart and start back over with all of your prep work and then applying glue and then clamping again. I utilized these shoe trees from Men's Warehouse in order to provide shape to the shoe and allow for a little bit more of a solid surface to push on. Alright guys, the sole swap is finally complete and I finally have my glow-in-the-dark reflective laces. Let's go ahead, remove the stock laces and get these things strapped on so we can do a final review of this sole swap hybrid. Putting new laces on the shoe is pretty straightforward and pretty easy, but I just want to remind you all to be delicate when removing the infinity laces, especially if you're trying to preserve them, because you will need to use a razor blade and obviously those can get really sharp. Alright everybody, that concludes my 380 700v3 sole swap. In this process, you guys saw as I took off the soles from both a pair of 700v3 Kyanites and took off the soles of a pair of 380 Calcite Glows. This was definitely one of the most challenging sole swap projects I've ever done. You obviously heard me talk a little bit about it earlier, but it was very, very challenging to remove the soles from both pairs and then to take off all of the glue afterwards proved to be pretty difficult as well. The actual re-gluing process was a little bit challenging as far as the actual alignment was concerned, something that you've already heard me talk about, but overall I think that these matched up pretty much perfectly, with the exception of some of the wrinkles that occurred on the footbed of the upper from the Kyanites. Obviously you saw I had to go ahead and replace the stock laces with some glow-in-the-dark laces, which is definitely a little bit of a process. It's not terribly difficult, but it's something that you have to be very careful doing because those infinity style laces are kind of tricky to get off, and unless you're going to cut them straight up, it can be a little bit tough to actually remove the threads that hold the wax part of the laces together. At any rate, let's dive into a deeper look at the finished product here so you guys can see how it came out in the end. We'll start off with taking a look at the left shoe, which is undoubtedly a little bit rougher than the right shoe. This is a shoe that I ended up gluing first, and one of the things that I quickly realized was that my placement as far as the toe cap was actually a little bit too medial on the shoe, and that actually shifted everything as I moved backwards. It didn't ruin the entire look of the shoe, but it kind of messed up the alignment. You can see there's a little bit of a gap right at the toe, right by the outsole, and that's on both sides. Just kind of a little unfortunate detail. It definitely doesn't ruin the wearability of the shoe. It doesn't look quite as neat and polished as it could have. As we come around to the lateral aspect of the toe portion of the shoe, you can see that this glowing cage did not tuck into the actual sole of the shoe. So we have a little bit of a glue line right there and a little bit of an awkward bulge. Again, it doesn't draw from the actual wearability of the shoe. It's just the overall aesthetic is a little bit compromised. As we continue down the lateral side of the shoe, everything looks pretty good until we get over to the mesh here. You can see that I did my glue lines a little bit high, which is not too much of an issue. You can't really tell with the mesh. However, when I was cleaning this mesh, I didn't realize that the material was a little bit more fragile. I ended up making a little bit of a hole in the material, and you can see to the mesh underneath the first layer. Very small mishap on the outsole midsole here. When I was actually removing the 380 upper, I kind of tore the midsole portion slightly. It's not enough that it's really noticeable, but it's there.
there, and it's something that could be fixed on my next go. Through the back here, the seal cup portion was a little bit more challenging to actually lock down the glue job with, and I ended up having to kind of dip some glue down in there and heat it up later on. You can see that there's even a little bit of a gap right here, but just with the way that the actual upper meshes up with the shoe, you can't really tell, and it's probably not something that I'm going to go through and mess around with all that much. Coming back onto the medial side of the heel cup, you can see again the fitment just a little bit off, a little bit more wrinkled in appearance than I'd like it to be, but just something that I learned with when I re-glued the right shoe. Again, coming over onto the mesh here, this side took a little bit more of a beating. There's a couple of holes, unfortunately, just because of the use of the harsh chemicals. The harsh chemicals and the mesh definitely did not get along very well during this process. One last little blemish as we come over to the glowing cage on the uppers here. You can see that during the removal process, I also caused a little bit of a tear in that cage. Unfortunate, but again, doesn't mess with the functionality or wearability of the shoe. You may be able to see there's actually these folds in the fabric of the 700v3 upper, and that's just due to, again, fitment issues. It's very hard to get this 100% precise when you're doing your re-gluing, so you gotta match it up as best as you can, and unfortunately those seem to be a part of the process. With the right shoe here, starting again at the toe, a lot cleaner. There's no real holes in between the upper and the toe cap of the shoe. You can see that I moved it just like millimeters more laterally, and it just matched up that much better. Coming over onto the lateral side of the shoe, it's actually a really solid glue job. Like, this looks pretty darn good. It's not 100% perfect, and you can tell as I get a little bit more to the back of the shoe here that there were a little bit more wrinkles in this glowing cage. Additionally, a little bit of a tear on the midsole, outsole kind of cup portion right there. But as you come back onto the heel here, again, pretty clean glue lines the entire way through. And the mesh on this right shoe did not get compromised at nearly as badly as the mesh on the left shoe. Coming up over onto the medial portion of the toe box, again, a little bit of an over glue. Realistically, looks really solid. These shoes overall, just as far as the way that they kind of matched up with one another, worked out pretty nicely. The overall gluing job was a little bit more challenging just due to the fact that the uppers aren't really that flexible, so you had to be pretty careful when you were actually clamping down all of the different surfaces. But once everything was said and done, everything looked pretty damn solid and actually feels absolutely incredible on foot. I've actually worn these for an entire day, and I was really pleased with the way that they felt. Thank you guys so much for tuning in to this sole swap hybrid video. I can definitely say with certainty that it is a lot more comfortable with the fact that the soles and the cages of these shoes now glow. I felt it necessary to throw some glow in the dark laces on there so that they would have the full-on 100% glow effect. A little bit cheesy, most definitely, but it's something that I really enjoy about the shoes, and I figured if they were gonna glow that heavy anyway, I might as well just go 100% balls to the wall with it. At any rate, I hope that you guys enjoyed this custom project right here. It was definitely one of the more challenging ones that I've ever done before, but I'm really happy with the final product, and I can't wait to do more sole swap customs in the future. If you guys have any suggestions as to what you might like to see in a sole swap hybrid, please let me know in the comments below, because I definitely want to hear some outside inspiration so that maybe I can put together some projects that I might not otherwise have thought up. As always, you can check out all the inventory that I have for sale on my website, www.sailboatssneakers.com. Make sure that you check me out on social media. Your best bet is Instagram, where I'm the most active, and that's at sailboats.sneakers. You can also find me on Twitter at sailboatsneaks. As always, thank you guys so much for tuning in to this episode of Sailboat's Customizations for this sole swap hybrid. I hope that you guys enjoyed it. Thanks for sticking around until the cold bitter end. I'm Sailboat, and I'm out of here. Oh yeah, and for anybody that wanted to actually see the glow on these, I'd say that those things, I'd say they glow pretty strong. Yeah, those things, those glow pretty fucking good, if you ask me. That's all I got for you.